Let me call us to order here, and we'll begin. I didn't realize I'm already late, so I'm starting behind the curve. I want to make an admission to you. Of all the guys in the room, I'm the slowest guy in the room, mentally slowest, and I can give concrete evidence to that. I didn't figure something out until 20 years after you figured something out. And I went and checked to see if I was, if my notes, if I'd missed something in seminary. If you've been out of seminary for more than a year, one of the conversations you'll hear people say is, well, nobody told us about that in seminary. And so I realized when we had gone to Woodruff Road, which is where I am now, we've been there 26 years, and been there 26 years, and it's been the best 15 years of my life. So if you need some explanation, that will come now. But I want to speak about the issue of wolves in the congregation. And I can guarantee everybody here, if you've been a pastor more than a couple of years, you've already had the issue. You may not have been able to identify it, but you've had the issue. And if you stay 3, 4, 5, 10 years, you will have the issue of wolves. And I can prove it to you exegetically. I want to try to do that this morning. But I have to give you a warning too, and my brother Bertie Kona can testify. The last time I spoke about this subject in Europe, it caused an earthquake.
Yes.
We were on a
5.3.
we were sitting on, I was talking to Bertie's elders, and we were sitting on a hillside overlooking the bay, and it was a beautiful day, and sure enough, I start talking about wolves, and we have an earthquake. So I'm doing cause and effect here. I'm thinking it's because of this talk. So you might want to be ready to get out the door pretty quick if the ground starts shaking. So many of you have had growth and health in your churches severely damaged by the presence and activity of wolves in your midst, and you didn't even know it. And I want to begin by defining the term simply, and then I'll define it in more detail in a few minutes. When we talk about what is a wolf, by that we're not talking about sad people or broken people with messy lives. We have a lot of those. We're not talking about garden variety lost people. We're not talking about people who come from other backgrounds, like they're charismatics or Catholics or whatever, but they're teachable and hungry. That's not a wolf. We're not even talking about people who have wacky ideas but are quiet about them. We have some of those. We're not talking about people who are socially awkward. I have a congregation full of those. We're not talking even about high maintenance people. We have all of the above that I just named, and I saw most of them last Sunday, and we shepherd them. But what we are talking about is people who have an agenda, a nefarious agenda. These are people who have aberrant doctrines or practices, and they want to spread them. And they want to spread them in your church. Now, I'm going to say this again in a moment, but one of the things you'll find out about wolves once you put them under the microscope is they're parasites. They're leeches. Because I've tried on several occasions to wolves say, bro, your doctrines, just go plant your own churches. And I've had some of them be honest and I'll say, no, we want to stay here and change your church. Wolves they never start their own church. They're parasitic. They want to leech off of your church. Well, when we're talking about wolves, again, preliminary definition, we're talking about people who would be a danger to your people. I think of a couple of men who came to our church to prey on single women, and wicked guys, and it didn't take us long to figure them out. We also had a couple of cases of would-be child molesters, but we spotted them very quickly and were able to show them the door. And we also recognize real quickly in dealing with wolves that these are people who strategically prey on the naive and undiscerning, people who can be taken in by strong personalities with fine-sounding arguments. So I want to ask the question, why should you, I'm assuming that most of the people in this room are elders or pastors or one or the other, sometimes both. Why should you be concerned about the presence and activity of wolves, just using the preliminary definition I gave, in your congregation? Well, because each of you, if you're in denominations like the PCA, which is my denomination, according to our Book of Church Order, elders have to take vows to guard the church's peace, purity, and unity. And so this means protecting the church from wolves. Think about, and I hope you have a Bible with you. I want you to think about what Scripture says, and I'll take you down my long journey and why I said I'm the slowest person. I was way past the 20-year mark in ministry before I actually read the Bible on this subject. I'd read the Bible through several times, but the bells weren't ringing for me yet. So I'm reading Acts chapter 20 when I'm on a hunt on this matter, where Paul, we're told in Acts 20, verses 28 through 31, he warns the elders of the church in Ephesus. Why would he feel so free to give them a warning? Well, he had planted the church, if you remember, back in Acts 18. So he's meeting with the elders of that church in Miletus, and he says to them, and here's what gets really creepy. He says to them, savage wolves will come in from the outside and rise up from among you. This shows you Paul's boldness. He has a group of these guys sitting on the fire, around the fire on the beach, and Paul says, from among you. That's pretty bold to say some of you are wolves. But Paul says it's going to be multi-directional. They're going to come in from the outside, and they're going to rise up from the inside. That's our story too. And if you've been a pastor for very long, you've seen the same thing happen. They rise up from the inside, come in from the outside. And so Paul says of these wolves, and this is how we start assembling our definition and MO of wolves. He says, they will not spare the flock. Wolves are ruthless and brutal. They will not spare the flock, and their intent is to draw away disciples after themselves. Paul follows up with this congregation, and this is where the long path began for me. Paul follows up on this congregation that he's planted in Acts 18, warns their elders in Acts 20, and then come the letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Do you know what congregation Paul was writing to? Ephesus. That those guys, he just had met with their elders. And now I've redone my definition. When you say, what church gave Paul the most grief? I would have said in Bible college, Corinth. Oh, Corinth. No, it's Ephesus, where Paul sends the letter, sends Ephesians, sends 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and repeatedly instructs the church how to deal with the wolves who did plague that church. And then Paul does something that he never does with Corinth. In 1 Timothy 1, he names them. Think of how amazing this is. He says, here's what you need to do with Hymenaeus and Alexander. And then in 2 Timothy, when he writes them back, says, oh, by the way, let me make the list longer. Now think about this poor church in Ephesus. They've got at least 6 named wolves in the congregation. He names Phygellus, Hermogenes, Philetus, and Demas, and then he brings up good old Hymenaeus and Alexander again. Apparently, they didn't get the hint. They didn't leave after the first list. And so it's not just Paul who addresses this, and this is one of the things I want to convince you of. I thought, and I'll give you my side road for a moment. I thought, why did we not talk about this in seminary? Because it turns out it's so prevalent in the New Testament documents. And I want to try to quickly prove to you that all the leading New Testament authors raise this issue and address it of wolves, false prophets, those who intend to do ill to the sheep. So I went back, I thought, maybe I wasn't paying attention that day in class. Went back and got my Pauline epistles notes. Nothing, wolves. Went back to my ecclesiology notes. I had George Knight. You're not going to do better than that for ecclesiology. Nothing about wolves. Called up my buddy Guy Waters at RTS in Jackson. Guy, do you have a unit on wolves in your New Testament classes? No. But why don't you write something up, Carl, and I'll throw that in after I gave him my case. Well, it turns out, so then I went on this really crazy hunt, talking to different guys from different seminaries, Westminster, RTS, Westminster West. Did you have any, like a half a lecture or a discussion in pastoral ministries class about wolves? No, I did not. So I've decided that there's this secret cabal of professors who say, let's not talk about wolves because nobody's doing it. Well, I want you to see this of how repetitive this is. Look at 2 Peter chapter 2. Peter, same thing. 2 Peter 2, Peter says, there were false prophets among the people, even as there will be. This is a solid word of prophecy. There will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies. And then this is a word of assurance from Peter. There will be false teachers among you. They will bring in destructive heresies secretly. And Peter even goes to the extent to say, and this is the one that sends a shiver up every pastor's back. Peter says, they will gain many followers. That's frightening to me because I don't want to lose one sheep. I don't want to lose one sheep to a wolf. And then Peter goes on to say that this, by the way, this is a hint of part of the rest of their methodology. Peter says there in 2 Peter 2, by them the way of truth will be blasphemed. These are antinomians. They don't mind being blasphemous in the prosecution of their agenda. So it's not just Paul with the church in Ephesus. It's not just Peter. Listen to John in 1 John 4. John writes, many false prophets have gone out into the world, says it again in 2 John 1. And so what you start to hear from these guys is this is going to be a normal part of pastoral ministry, dealing with wolves in your congregation. Remember, coming in from the outside, rising up from the inside. So I was in chasing this idea. This is 18 years ago. I was studying the history of trouble in one congregation, Ephesus, because I got it. I realized, okay, Paul's writing these letters in 1st and 2nd Timothy. He addresses the Ephesian elders. So just the church in Ephesus. And I started applying all this to my own congregation. That's a frightening thing to do. And the lights came on for me. We had a problem with wolves. It turns out it was a big problem. We'd been racked with difficulty and division for my first 8 years, almost 9 years at Woodruff Road, because of pastoral turmoil. I didn't understand the cause. And when I came to Woodruff Road, we had this immediate, tremendous surge of growth, mostly transfer growth. Should have noticed that. Because I thought all these people were coming for my powerful preaching and sparkling personality. Well, I did notice, and when I was confessing my sin of pastoral malpractice to my session and offering to resign because of this, I did notice in several of the membership interviews things that should have been a red flag. Odd views, strange practices, and contentiousness. But I was laboring under the notion, the false notion, especially if you're in a Presbyterian church, I was laboring under the notion that if someone had a credible profession and desired membership, we had to receive them. I have good news for you. You don't have to. And I'll read out of our very own book of church order in just a moment. But I thought you had to take these people in because invariably every one of them would say, oh yeah, I believe in Jesus. I believe I'm saved by faith alone, but I'm in the KKK. But I have these odd views. I mean, we had Kenists. We had other wacky ideas. So we took in dozens of these people. Some of them ended up teaching Sunday school. I was just handing a wolf a platform. Some of them ended up on the diaconate, and here's the crazy part. One of them ended up on the session at our church. Scroll the clock forward a few years, and we were drowning in difficult pastoral issues. So we were doing discipline for guys who were anarchists, tax protesters, Kenists. For those of you who are in Europe and don't know what that is, good. I'm glad you don't, but it's our newest American form of racism in the church, baptized racism. So I woke up and realized this, and I went to our session. I said, guys, this is all my fault. If I had said to these people, we are not going to admit you as a communing member, we wouldn't have to be spending inordinate amounts of time and energy and capital on discipline cases on these people. So the session, thankfully, I have a group of humble and godly men. They repented with me and said, Carl, it's our fault too. We're right there with you. And they wouldn't let me resign. So I began to think carefully through this issue. Can we actually turn down folks for membership who have a credible profession of faith and desire membership? And the answer is, if you're a Presbyterian, yes. And since 1788, every Presbyterian book of church order in every country has taken John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was a Scot who came to America to be the president of Princeton. But Witherspoon was a Presbyterian, grown up in a Presbyterian house. And he wrote up 8 preliminary principles. They've gone in the front of every book of church order. And he writes this preliminary principle. I would have been saved a lot of trouble if I just read my own book of church order, where Witherspoon writes, every Christian church or union or association of particular churches is entitled to declare the terms of admission into its communion and the qualification of its members. It goes on into greater detail, but Witherspoon's basically saying, you don't have to take anybody. The session can make that judgment. Well, let me tell you the different types of wolves we've had, because now we've put this under the microscope. We had doctrinal wolves, people who were teaching things completely against the Westminster Confession. As I said, we had kinism, anti-government, tax protesters, and we had a strident group of people promoting federal vision. And so we had to address this. It helped an awful lot when the PCA's General Assembly condemned that as heresy several years ago in 2007. But we not only had doctrinal wolves, we had moral wolves. These are people who encouraged lawlessness and antinomianism. And we had relational wolves who gossiped and divided and deceived. Now, I had, as I said earlier, I had no seminary training on wolves. We've started, my fellow pastors and I have started to keep this journal of things we didn't learn in seminary. And that book's getting awful big these days. So and we're on the front doorstep of a seminary. So I tell my seminarians all the time, guys, don't delude yourself into thinking you're getting everything you need from a seminary curriculum. And because there's so many things that you aren't studying there. So I realized as we were doing this, I really needed to know how to spot them. And I realized that I hadn't even listened to Jesus very carefully. When Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, if you know anything about the chronology of that, that's preached early in Jesus' ministry. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus begins to give warnings there on the Sermon on the Mount when he says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. And then Jesus says, the thing that haunted me, I thought, this is proof that I'm the slowest guy in the room. Jesus says, you will know them by their fruit. You'll have cognitive awareness. You'll be able to see that. And so according to Jesus, wolves are knowable. So if you have wolves in your congregation and you're walking right past them, shame on me and you both, because Jesus says they're knowable. You can spot them by these criteria. And he actually says that twice in Matthew chapter 7. One of the clues, according to Jesus, is they practice lawlessness. In other words, wolves are always antinomian. Well, we're talking about guarding the church from such people. Why? Again, because the officers of the church took solemn public vows to do so. I raised my hand and swore in front of my congregation 26 years ago, do you promise to strive for the purity, peace, unity, and edification of the church? Now, I dropped the ball. Well, wolves want to disrupt the peace, purity, and unity of the church. They don't want to edify. Wolves are not builders. So we have to guard the sheep from them. That's what shepherding is. Remember what Jesus said in John 10 about shepherds? And I would charge each of you men here in this room, pastors, elders, this is your task. You're on duty this Sunday. Jesus says, he speaks about the hireling in John 10. He says he's not a shepherd. He doesn't own the sheep. He sees the wolf coming, and he leaves the sheep and flees. So that's the first wrong response to a wolf. If you see the wolf coming and you run, my friends, you are not qualified to be a shepherd. Because an elder, a pastor, he always is willing to hit the wolf head on. So I've taken that as my mandate now for almost the last 18 years, because Jesus says the wolf, if he catches the sheep, he will devour them. He will scatter them. So Jesus tells us something about the wolf there in John 10, that the wolf is determined to scatter the sheep. When I realized what was happening right under my nose, I could visually see people at our Sunday night service doing this, and I would see guys in the narthex of our church, hey, here's this cassette. This is this Doug Wilson cassette. Here, don't let Carl see that, but take that home, listen to it. And hey, come over to my house afterwards. We're having a post-mortem session tonight at my house afterwards. Our wolves that we had were they would siphon off people and they would privately teach them. They'd correct my theology and the theology of our other pastors. So the good shepherd, when Jesus speaks about this in John 10, he goes on and says, the good shepherd sees the wolf coming. In other words, he has discernment. He's not dopey like I was. He stands in and fights the wolves off instead of fleeing. And he cares enough, he loves the sheep enough to repel the wolves. Well, again, when Paul is speaking to the Ephesian elders about this, remember the methodology. He says, wolves will come in, that means from the outside, and they'll rise up from among yourselves. They won't spare the flock. Paul is clear that wolves are ravenous. They don't care about destroying the congregation. They think nothing of that. They will, Paul says, they'll speak perverse things. These are the lawless men. Jesus said, you'll know them if you have even one eye open. And I said a moment ago, they're parasitic. Wolves never plant churches. They never build their own congregation. They leech off yours. So if your ministry is to be Pauline, it must involve constant watchfulness for wolves. Do you remember what Paul says to the church in Ephesus? He said, I was with you for 2 or 3 years. I warned you night and day with tears. Every day, Paul is saying, watch out for wolves. Watch out for them. So that's why it's no surprise that Paul actually lists 6 of them by name in his letters to 1st and 2nd Timothy. So turns out this is, as I said, not just Paul writing these words, not just Jesus. Paul, Peter, and John say the exact same thing. Well, when Paul puts pen to parchment to write the pastoral epistles, especially 1st and 2nd Timothy, Paul then really ramps up his game there. He says in 1 Timothy 4, the Spirit expressly says that some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, commanding to abstain from foods. By the way, we just had our latest food wolf a few months ago at Woodruff Road. We had a woman who was coming to our intro class. We've tried to make it harder for wolves to get in, and so we have now a 14-week intro class. Most wolves don't have the patience to sit through 14 weeks. But we still have some who they're kind of Calvinistic wolves. They'll persevere for 14 weeks. So this woman was going through the class, and she came to me and she said, Carl, I'd really like to tell you, I think the Lord's calling me to teach here at the church. And I said, well, we can talk about that in a couple of years, but we have some pretty wonderful women's ministry teachers. And she immediately stepped back. She wanted to teach men. And so she said, you can look at some of my content. Here's my website. So I went home that day. I'm not on social media, but my wife is. It's not good for my sanctification to be on social media. So looked at this woman's website, and sure enough, there it was right on the front page of her website. Is if you eat meat, you're in sin. And you should eat only vegetables. That's what Jesus ate, which isn't true, by the way. And so that was going to be what she wanted to teach for our women's Bible studies, the sin of eating meat, according to her. What we found out was she didn't bother to tell us she had been excommunicated from John MacArthur's church and never been restored. So we were able to quickly say, we're not the church for you. Those are the happiest days of my life now when I say to people, we are not the church for you. And you need to get really good at that, at saying that, because I've actually had people say, no, I think it really is the church for me. Nope, we'll guarantee you, we will never receive you as a member. And so let me tell you what to do if you have a wolf problem. Let me give you a few concrete steps. Somebody's going to have to tell me what time to quit because I have no idea and I could talk about this all day. The first is you and your elders must know what a wolf is. That's about as basic as it gets. Have to know what a wolf is. So that means study the key passages in the pastoral epistles. And you'll find this. And maybe you just need to carry this around on a laminated card and go like this as you walk around your church on Sunday. First of all, a wolf is a false teacher who snatches up sheep. That's Jesus' definition in John 10:12. A wolf is someone who draws disciples away from the public theology of the church. A wolf is one who opposes the truth. That's Paul's definition in 2 Timothy 3:8. A wolf is a person who leads people to make shipwreck of the faith and embrace ungodliness. And a wolf, more than anything, is one who divides the flock. He's always divisive. So a second thing to do, first of all, know what a wolf is. You and your elders, study the key passages. This is worth a few weeks of you studying this together with your leadership. We make this a part of, we're in a cycle right now of nominations and elections. We make this a part of our leadership training, and I teach it. And at our place, I not only teach the content, I teach the history and say, Woodruff Road has at least now 26-year history. You need to know this if you're going to come into the leadership. Second thing to do is elders must then expect to have, because Paul says so and Jesus says so, must expect to have wolves in the church rising up from the inside, coming in from the outside. That's Paul's term. Never be surprised at wolves. You have to say, yeah, we expect it anytime. A third thing about what to do. Once you've spotted them, don't receive them as members. Now, I will tell you, because I'm in Calvary Presbyterian, the PCA, we have like 47 churches in an area about as big as Budapest, which is wild. We're on top of one another. I actually have brothers in this presbytery who I love. I adore them. Pastor who said, Carl, I think you're being a little harsh. I'll take in wolves. I said, no, I'll take in sad people. I'll take in awkward people. Just look around my congregation, you'll see. We'll take in all these people, but who I will not take in is wolves. And I've had one guy said, he's very pastoral, don't you think we ought to work with wolves? I said, no. I said, I'm speaking metaphorically, so don't take me literally. Speaking metaphorically, but I said, I don't take them in. We shoot them in the head is what we do. So I'll actually expand on that. When we say, once you've spotted them, don't receive them as members, this accounts for, and this is a testimony, this accounts for the peace and purity of Woodruff Road over the last 15 years, is we've repeatedly refused to take in wolves as members. We've just said, we're just not going to do it. I'm not going to work with wolves. And once you understand deeply who the wolf is he's a reprobate. He's never going to repent. And so you can work with them all day long for the next decade, and they're not going to repent. Well, the next step is, once you've spotted them, don't receive them as members. But an addendum to that is chase them off. As a kid, I spent every July on my grandfather's ranch in western Oklahoma, and he had a distinct problem with wolves and coyotes. And you would hear them every night out in the ranch. The coyotes' howl was a little bit distinctive from the wolves, but you could hear them both. And my granddad despised wolves and coyotes. He lived in a tiny ranch house, and he had 2 rifles, one by the front door, one by the back door. And as soon as he heard them, you never heard them during the day. And as soon as he heard them, he would grab the rifle and say to my brother and I, come on, boys, let's go. And the Western movie was on at that point when we did that. We thought this was the greatest thing ever. And he despised wolves and coyotes because they preyed on his cattle. They'd try to break into his chicken houses. And so part of his solution for dealing with wolves and coyotes is he had 2 brought from Germany German shepherds. He actually had to learn a few German commands. This is my Oklahoma granddad, had to learn some German. I don't think he spoke it well, but he had 2 of them, Bruno and Missy. That's not a very intimidating sounding dog, but he kept these 2 German shepherds. They never came in the house. They were outside, and they had one job: to chase away wolves and coyotes. Well, I remember the night I was 12 years old when Bruno came to the back door, and Bruno never wanted in the house, but Bruno came to the screen back door. And I was the first one who saw him. He was covered in blood all over his head, all over his face. And especially somebody had tried to get his jugular vein because he had a heavily bleeding wound right here. And so my grandmother grabbed a towel and started to nurse him. And my grandfather said, boys, we need to go out and see who's out there. So we start walking out, and we're about 50 yards away from the house. And a dead wolf is laying there in the field. Bruno had done his job. He had almost died himself, but he had killed the wolf. So my grandfather, who wasn't a real affectionate man, he came in and hugged Bruno. Bruno could barely even lift his head. My grandfather says, this is why we have you, to protect the livestock from wolves. And that's how I view elders and deacons of the church now, as the watchdogs who will chase off the wolves. That's how you ought to view the elders in your church, as fellow shepherds. It's interesting in the Locus Classicus on shepherding, Ezekiel 34, you'll remember that the Lord takes issue with what he calls the worthless shepherds of the day in Ezekiel 34. And here's one of his issues he has with them, according to verse 5 of Ezekiel 34. You didn't chase off the wild beasts. Would the Lord come and rebuke you and your elders and say, guys, you're coddling them. You're not chasing them off. And so what I found, by the way, this is just pastoral wisdom. Maybe it's just Woodruff Road and we're odd. We are odd. But anytime we've had wolves spotted and called out, in our experience, they don't stick around. They move on to greener pastures where the elders there are clueless and stupid, and where they can cause more trouble. So when we say, look, Paul did it on 6 occasions in 1st and 2nd Timothy. He named them. Forever in the Word of God is going to be the names of these 6 wolves. And so what's prefatory to chasing wolves also is naming them. Now, I will tell you, when we really got a good handle on that we were dealing with a wolf problem, we took a sessional retreat, went up to the mountains in North Carolina, and we have this thing called the placemat. It's the entire membership of Woodruff Road, all 760 people, on one sheet of paper. It's in like 0.02 font size, but it's everybody in the church. And I gave all the guys my list, and I said, I've highlighted 21 names. That's a lot of wolves. I said, I think they're wolves, according to this definition. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. So the guys went to, yes. Carl, you forgot one over here. And so we agreed, we covenanted together to go back and start chasing off wolves. And what was funny was, as soon as we did, these guys were like, oh, okay, this is not going to be fun anymore. And we'd said, not only are we not going to let such men be elders or deacons, we're not going to let them be ushers. We're not going to let them hand out a bulletin. We don't want these folks in any position where somebody could think they have weight or authority. So what we had learned is wolves, if they're not chased off, attract more wolves. We had a fellow who was heavily into the Federal Vision. I didn't know this, but he was standing in the parking lot with his wolf buddies on Sunday morning handing out tapes. You guys do know what a cassette tape is, right? I'm really aging myself here. That's about 5 iterations back in terms of technology. So we had ordained a wolf as a deacon. So wolves confuse your members. If you say, Carl, are these beliefs okay? They must be, because these fellows are going around promoting them inside the church. And we actually lost members who weren't wolves because they said, we don't want to be in a church that allows this. Because the real Christians, they don't want wolves in the congregation. So you're doing a service if you chase them off. So another step about how to deal with wolves, if they're inside the flock already, name them. That's why we took our placemat out and we just said, do we agree that Bill and Bob and Joe? Yes. And so we had that on our docket for the next few months as we slowly worked our way through our wolves and said, you need to leave now. So, and most of them left immediately as soon as they were spotted and called out. And if you're thinking, I think that's harsh, Paul did it. He named 6 men under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He named 6 men who are wreaking havoc on the church in Ephesus. Well, a 6th issue of what to do with wolves. If they are teaching or leading or doing any role in the church, formal or informal, especially chase them off. You cannot have them legitimized. As I remember one person in the congregation saying, well, Billy Bob says you're chasing him off. He's my Sunday school teacher. He's a good Sunday school teacher. No, he's not. He's a wolf. And you're right, we are chasing him off. And it's incredibly confusing to the congregation if you allow wolves to have any sort of position of leadership. And then the 7th thing of what to do with wolves, and we've only had to do this with one wolf, discipline them. Listen to what Paul says in that other pastoral epistle. By the way, I'm convinced now that the pastoral epistles are not studied at the level they should be. Because I went back and looked at my seminary notes. I had great professors on 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and so many of the pastoral issues I faced and others have faced is never dealt with in class. And so I think it's a neglected treasure, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So Paul says, reject a divisive man after the first and second admonition. In other words, he's counseling the same pattern that Jesus already established in Matthew 18, knowing that such a person is warped in sinning, being self-condemned. So again, the wolf is divisive. That's what Paul says to the church in Crete. Reject a divisive man. The wolf is divisive. He loves to create factions. We had one guy who he always wanted to be an usher and wanted to be a bulletin hander outer on Sunday mornings. And if new people walked up to the door, unbeknownst to us for about a year, he was pulling people aside. I see you have children. What's your schooling choice? Well, we go to so-and-so elementary. You're in sin because the only legitimate form of schooling is homeschooling. This guy was doing this underneath our nose and we didn't know it. And talk about divisive. And so we had people, unbeknownst to us, who had come up to the door, been told that, and went right back to their car and left. I don't blame them. And then we had him dividing on other issues as well. Well, so if the Lord is calling you to office in a Reformed church, he's calling you to exercise wise discernment and exercise biblical discipline. Now, if you don't know what that means, discipline, and you shudder back against it, discipline, according to Hebrews 12, is a positive thing, and God disciplines every son. It's positive. Discipline's not negative. It's not harsh. As we've had people before, after I read the Matthew 18, said, I think that's so harsh. I said, so does that mean you're more gentle than Jesus? Is that what that means? Because Jesus is the one who teaches Matthew 18 discipline. We're told the sequential methodology of how to address sin in fellow confessing believers. We only had to go as far as the step of discipline with one wolf. The rest cleared out pretty quickly without any trouble. And then, of course, you have the case in 1 Corinthians 5 where Paul demands to skip the steps of Matthew 18 and go straight to excommunication for the man in egregious sexual sin. So finally, just so you'll hear the full story, Paul addresses the desire of godly elders and ministers to humbly restore the repentant person. Do you know how many wolves we've had come back and repent? None. Because wolves are reprobates by definition. These are the non-elect. These are people who their goal is not to lead a healthy Christian life and leave others in that, but to destroy the church. Well, I want to leave some time. I don't know how much time I have left. Please tell me. But I want to leave some time for question and answer, because invariably when I talk about this, people have a lot of questions. So I wanted to leave time for that. How much time do we have left? 15 minutes. Great. We can get in at least 2 questions.